Hi everyone, today's video is going to be a refurbishment of the front brakes on my Avanzato, which as you can see in this before clip are in a right state. I'm not sure how well taken care of they were in the first place, and then being sat for over a decade has really rusted them up, though they don't appear to be seized, which is a relief. The design of the front brakes is all pretty standard. A single piston caliper floats on two pins, clamping the pads onto a 234mm one-piece vented disc. First up, you'll need some discs and pads. Here I'm using Mintex products, which are part numbers MDC1974 for the discs and MDB1857 for the pads. They're actually sold as being for the Move miniature MPV. You can obviously find them from other brands, though make sure that what you get matches up to what's on the car. If you get discs for a normal Cuore, you'll probably get those for an L700 car and they won't fit, even though the compatibility charts some of the sellers use say they are correct for an Avanzato. Because the disc is mounted behind the hub has to be removed to get at it. Our first job is to make sure that the main hub nut is loosened off. It has a small detent hammered into the groove from the driveshaft end to act as a locking feature, so I've knocked that back out and then cracked off the initial tightness. What I'm doing now is just using a crowbar to brace against the hub and stop it moving while I back the nut off a few more turns. Incidentally, this is a 32mm socket that you need to be using here. Now, I wouldn't use this approach with the crowbar to initially loosen a nut because it can easily be tight enough that bracing it like this risks damaging your wheel studs. Instead, get someone to apply the brakes good and hard to stop the hub turning, or if you're working on your own, bolt a wheel on with no centre cap and use the centre hole to get at the nut with the car on the ground. Either way, there's no need to fully remove the nut yet, as the hub can't be pulled off with the caliper still in place. Before starting on removing the caliper, I gave it an initial going over to remove some of the worst rust, but as I'd already decided to remove the caliper entirely for painting, I'll be able to get at a bit more of it once it's off the car. Again, because I'm removing the caliper entirely, in addition to removing the two slide bolts, it will need to be disconnected from the car's hydraulics. Normally you use these line wrenches for fittings like this, in this case 14mm. But in my experience they can flex and slip on old rusted tight fittings. Instead, for that first loosening, I prefer to use a crow's foot wrench like this. They're much thicker and so less likely to flex off, and with a breaker bar it makes short work of loosening the joint. As with the hub nut, we have a couple of steps prior to it being fully removed. Before going any further, I need to seal off this hose from the rest of the hydraulics with this special clamping plier. The round jaws on this won't crush and damage the structure of the pipe, and doing this minimises how much fluid gets out and air gets in when I remove the caliper. That done, I can undo the two slide bolts with a 14mm socket, and they pull all the way out the caliper and carrier. These act as the pins the caliper floats on side to side. Note that the top and bottom one are a slightly different design, the top one having a small end piece on it, so keep a note of which one is which for when you refit them. The caliper will now just pull off, but you don't want to be hanging it off the hose or twisting the hose about trying to undo it. So with the line wrench just to make sure it's loose, I'm then turning the caliper itself to unscrew it from the end of the hose. Then it goes to one side to be cleaned up properly. The pads come out the carrier, as do the pad fitting clips. The carrier can then be unbolted with a 17mm socket and removed again to be cleaned up along with the caliper. Now the other parts are out of the way, the hub can be removed. A few taps on the back of the old disc showed that it wasn't seized onto the splines, so I was able to just spin the nut off and pull it away by hand. You can see here where it seats against the wheel bearing. It's not quite so common for a hub to come off with so little effort, and indeed on the other side I had to break out a proper puller to get it shifted. Just be aware that this is a strong risk with this kind of job, and be prepared for upping the ante in order to be able to get it out. Having masked off the centre of the hub carrier to prevent any muck getting into the wheel bearing, the wire wheel is put to work again cleaning up the backplate and mounting flange. One corner of the backplate had suffered some corrosion damage, but it wasn't enough to justify replacement, so I used a cut-off wheel on a Dremel to just remove that section and neaten things up. With masking tape applied to where the caliper carrier mounts onto the mounting ears, so that there won't be a build-up of paint interfering with correct reassembly, the backplate and hub carrier assembly are given a coat of black chassis paint to protect them going forward. For fiddly jobs like this, I found it's usually easier to brush paint rather than spend ages trying to mask everything up for spraying, and it's not the kind of thing that needs to be a perfect finish, so brushing is just fine. For jobs like this, I tend not to bother even washing the brushes. I just buy really cheap ones and chuck them away when I'm done. This isn't at all necessary as part of the job, but it's an area that's only accessible with the hub off like this, and it really freshens things up. Now I can move on to the caliper. I'm just dousing the bleed nipple with some plus gas penetrating oil and then using an 8mm spanner to make sure the nipple moves freely. These bleeders are a very common thing to seize on any car, and you want to make sure they're okay while you've got the caliper off to work on it. With the bleeder open, I squeeze back the piston, which feels nice and smooth in its action, and doing this both makes room for the caliper to go over the new pads, plus minimises the volume of air trapped in the system when things get reassembled. Any remaining rust is knocked back on the caliper, and the carrier gets cleaned up as well. To mask off where I don't want paint, I use a combination of masking tape and blanking off things like mounting lugs with old bolts to stop paint getting into threads and so on. I then use some brake paint to spray up the caliper and carrier, and you can see here I've actually made this little wooden jig to hold them in a good position for getting the paint all over them. With all the painted components left for the paint to cure, I need to remove the hub from the old discs, the two being held together by these 4 bolts. A 14mm socket is what you need, and again I'm using a crowbar just to give me something to turn against. As with the hub nut, take care you're not using so much force that you'll damage the studs. You can actually get at these bolts while everything's still together with the wheel off, so if you do have an assistant to push the brake pedal, cracking them loose at that earlier stage may be a good call. You may find that the hub is slightly seized to the disc, in which case all you need to do is just gently pull at it while you clobber the old disc with a mallet. The shock will help separate the two, and in my case also cause a disgruntled earwig to make a break for freedom. With some gentle wire wheel work to make sure the flange on the hub is squeaky clean and will sit flat on the disc mating face, the old disc gets double checked against the new one to ensure they're identical, and the hub checked to confirm it fits with no play. Using some thread locker on the bolts, the two get assembled together, and I taut them up. One last touch is to make sure the hub face is cleaned up, even though I'm not going to be painting this area, and then get the braking surface on either side of the disc as clean as possible. New discs often come with a film of oil on them that you should clean off before use, but some discs come with an electroplated finish for corrosion protection, and these will say on the box or on the leaflet that comes with them if you're meant to leave this on rather than clean it off. On the inside face, a small amount of wheel bearing grease goes on where it will seat up against the bearing. The hub and disc assembly then slots back onto the car, and I nipped up the nut most of the way. Ideally you should replace these nuts each time, but I decided mine was still okay to reuse. I'm not fully tightening it with the detent knocked in yet, as that's something I'll revisit at the end of the job. The carrier goes back on next, and you can, if you want to, load it up with the pad fitting clips and the new pads before putting it on, if you find that easier to do. I put mine on afterwards, as you would do if you're just doing a normal pad change on the car. For the brake pads, I couldn't find the exact right pad fitting clips, so I took a bit of a chance on some similar ones being compatible, but unfortunately that gamble didn't pay off. So instead I cleaned up the old ones with some brake cleaner and a wire brush so I could reuse them. The pad fitting clips then just snap back into the carrier on either side. The original pads on the car had these anti-rattle shims on them, but the new pads didn't come with any, and the old ones were way too far gone to reuse. Instead I used the traditional anti-squeal method of a very thin smear of copper grease on the back of the pads, which then get fitted into the carrier. Now the caliper itself can go back on. I spin it onto the end of the brake hose and give it a quick nip up with a spanner to make sure it's home, and then place it into position on the carrier. The slide pins get a smear of high temperature grease and both go through the caliper into the carrier before being tightened up. With the hose clamp removed, everything's back together and I wiped off the excess copper grease from the outer pad. Here I've fitted the spare wheel, as it still gives good access to the hub nut. Checking there's no play without being too tight on rotation, I know that the hub nut is done at the right amount and I can knock the detent back in to lock it into place. Usually you bleed the brakes after having the caliper off like this, but I still have the rear brakes to look at, so I'm going to leave it for now in case I need to do anything back there. Having been careful to prevent air getting in during the work, however, the amount of bleeding required should be minimal. So here's the comparison of where I came from with the original condition of the brakes, looking rather rusty and horrible, and what I have now, which looks much cleaner and fresher and more looked after. Huge improvement and another very necessary job ticked off the list. I hope this has been interesting and useful to you, and you'll like, subscribe and comment below. And I'll see you again next time.